The Ardennes forest lay under a thick blanket of snow, silent except for the occasional whistle of a cold wind cutting through the skeletal trees. It was December 19, 1944, and the forest seemed almost frozen in time, as if the world itself had paused to watch what was about to happen. The gray sky hung low, heavy with clouds, blotting out the weak winter sun and casting the landscape in shades of white and silver. In this cold, colorless world, danger could move unseen. Perched on a ridge inside the cramped, ice-covered hull of an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson squinted through his periscope. He was small and quiet, not the kind of man who drew attention, but there was something about him that made him different. Thompson had a mind that worked like a clock. He saw patterns, calculated angles, and predicted movements with the precision of a mathematician. To his crew he was known as the Quiet Clock. He rarely spoke, but when he did it was always important. For 2 days Thompson and his 3-man crew, Sergeant Kowalski, the driver Peterson, and the loader S from Brooklyn, had watched the forest. Their orders were clear. Observe, report, do not fire. Even if a German tank appeared, they were to stay hidden. The chain of command was absolute. No one acted without orders. The rules were simple yet cruel in their rigidity. Any mistake, any premature action could bring death not only to themselves but to countless others. But now Thompson's eyes caught a movement. A flicker, small and distant, barely visible through the fog of snow and mist. At first he thought it was a trick of the cold wind, maybe a branch swaying. But then it appeared again. A shadow larger than any animal creeping through the trees. He adjusted the periscope and froze. His heart did not race. He rarely let emotion rule him, but a cold clarity settled over him. 12 German tanks, moving steadily down the narrow forest path, were advancing toward the American lines. The lead tank was a Tiger, a steel beast that could crush an M10 without effort. Behind it, the rest of the column followed with frightening discipline. Thompson knew immediately what this meant. The radio, their only link to the battalion, was dead. A frozen wire, perhaps, or the weather swallowing the signal. Any call for help would never reach command. The orders were clear: do not engage. But waiting, doing nothing, would mean disaster. Hundreds of American soldiers were in the line of this German spearhead. Every second of hesitation increased the risk of death for men Thompson would never know personally, yet whose lives depended on his decisions. Inside the tank, the air was bitter and still. Peterson chewed on a hard, frozen ration cracker, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. S tapped impatiently on the metal floor, trying to break the quiet. Sergeant Kowalski stood rigid, eyes darting between the trees and his men. Thompson did not speak. He studied the approaching column through the periscope, his mind moving faster than the enemy itself. He saw the perfect spacing of the tanks, their formation flawless, their discipline rigid. The Tiger at the front, Panzer IVs and half-tracks for support, fuel and ammunition trucks trailing behind. It was a textbook advance, a steel serpent moving through the snow, oblivious to the trap it was walking into, but Thompson did not yet know how he would strike. That was not his concern now. The first task was observation, understanding, calculation. He thought back briefly to the morning briefing with Captain Langston. "Do not fire without direct orders," the captain had said. Thompson had nodded, as he always did, listening carefully. But rules were not problems, they were constraints. Thompson saw constraints as puzzles to be solved, angles to be measured, probabilities to calculate. The forest around him, the enemy ahead, the frozen earth beneath, they were pieces of a vast, deadly equation. A sudden gust of wind sent snow swirling through the tank's open hatch, stinging their faces and freezing their lungs. Thompson blinked against the cold, keeping his focus on the distant line of German steel. Every detail mattered: the angle of the tanks, the slope of the terrain, the shallow ditch to the right that could be used for cover. Each piece of information slotted into his mind with the clarity of numbers on a blackboard. Time stretched. The column continued its advance, slow but unstoppable. Thompson felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was no officer, no commander, he was just one man in a small tank hidden in the forest. Yet in this moment, the lives of hundreds depended on his eyes, his mind, and the courage to act. As the lead Tiger drew closer, its massive gun turret pivoting lazily, Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. He understood something that others could not. Waiting was not safety. Waiting was death. And for the first time, the quiet clock considered breaking the rules. The forest held its breath. Snow fell like ash from a gray sky. And somewhere ahead, the steel serpent advanced, unaware that one small American tank, guided by one mind that could see the patterns of war, would decide the fate of a battle yet to be fought. 3 days earlier, the world had already begun to unravel in the Ardennes. The German offensive, codenamed Wacht dem Rhein, had shattered the Allied front. Entire units had been swallowed by the storm of men and machines moving through the dense, snow-choked forest. For the Americans, it was no longer a battle, it was a nightmare. The snow was deep and treacherous. Every step threatened to trap a soldier, and every shadow seemed to hide the enemy. Fog clung to the trees, thick as wool, swallowing sound and sight alike. The cold was a relentless enemy of its own, cracking steel and freezing men from the inside out. In those first days of the German advance, soldiers were encircled and annihilated overnight. Supply lines vanished, radios died, and communication collapsed into static and panic. Command had ceased to exist. The most dangerous enemy was no longer the Tiger tank or Panzer column, it was uncertainty itself. Inside a drafty Belgian farmhouse, Captain Langston of the 7,002nd Tank Destroyer Battalion addressed his men with a voice flat as ice. The room smelled of wet wool, fear and exhaustion. His face, lined and weary, looked like a map of battles fought and barely survived. "I don't care what you see," he said, eyes sweeping over the room, locking on each crew in turn. "I don't care if a tiger parks itself on your front lawn and asks for directions. Do not give away your position. Not without a direct order from me or Battalion HQ. Do you understand?" The men nodded. They understood the logic. One wrong shot could draw German artillery down on their heads, or worse, kill their own men in friendly fire. Just a week ago, a tank destroyer had fired on a silhouette in the fog, an American M8 Greyhound, and killed 4 comrades. That incident had sent shockwaves through the chain of command. The cure for chaos, it seemed, was absolute control. But the men on the front lines felt like prisoners in their own tanks. One of them, Ray Thompson, listened silently. He wasn't focused on fear or rules or punishment. He was calculating. To him, every object, every vehicle, every snow-covered mound was a variable. The forest was not a place of randomness. It was a puzzle, a series of angles, distances, and opportunities. Thompson had grown up on the wide, flat plains of western Kansas. His father was a mechanic, teaching him that every machine had a pattern. His mother was a math teacher, instilling in him the belief that numbers were the secret language of the universe. As a boy, he built intricate pulley systems and launched stones into buckets from incredible distances, never missing. When he enlisted in 1942, it wasn't for patriotism but for the chance to study engineering in action. The war, however, had a way of turning everything personal. In the Ardennes, Thompson had learned quickly that angles could kill. He filled notebooks with sketches of German tanks, marking armor thickness, turret speed, and blind spots. Other soldiers called him a quiet clock because he moved precisely, efficiently, like the ticking of a perfect timepiece. Now, perched on a ridge north of Noville, Thompson and his crew were the only eyes for miles. Their M10 Wolverine tank destroyer was dug into the snow, hidden beneath a camouflage netting dusted with frost. For 2 days nothing moved. Only shadows played tricks on their eyes, and snowflakes blurred the lines between the living and the inanimate. The tension inside the tank was a living thing, pressing against every muscle, every nerve. Peterson chewed on a frozen cracker. Ash tried jokes but they fell flat. Kowalski shifted uneasily, scanning the horizon again. Thompson, however, was focused. His mind ran through calculations, arcs, probabilities, and patterns. Every tree, every dip in the road, every rise in the snowbank mattered. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, a vibration passed through the earth, subtle but undeniable. Peterson felt it through the floor plates. "Do you guys feel that?" he whispered. Thompson pressed his eye to the periscope, sweeping the tree line left to right. Nothing. Then a flicker. A shadow moving with purpose. A bird took flight, startled, but the cold of December made birds' flight rare. Thompson adjusted the magnification, scanning the faint outline. There it was. The unmistakable shape of a Tiger tank leading a dozen vehicles. The Germans were not probing, they were advancing with intent. 5 kilometers down the road, the German commander, Hetman Klaus Richter, stood in the open turret of his Tiger I. A veteran of the Eastern Front, he was confident, disciplined, and contemptuous of the American soldiers he now faced. He believed in the superiority of German armor, in his men's training, and in the failure of the enemy to act decisively. His orders were simple: seize Noville, cut the northern supply route into Bastogne, and clear the way for the army behind him. His intelligence had told him resistance would be minimal. A few scattered infantry, perhaps some reconnaissance units, nothing that could stand against the might of his Tiger and the supporting panzer columns. But the Americans were not what they seemed. Thompson watched the column through the periscope, counting 12 vehicles with deadly precision. Lead element, Tiger. They were moving with perfect spacing, confident and disciplined. Every second they drew closer to their objective, and every second Thompson's mind calculated what he would need to do if he broke protocol. The radio, their lifeline, hissed and spat static. Multiple attempts to contact headquarters failed. Dusty 4, Thompson's call sign, went unheard. Alone, paralyzed by orders, the crew faced a single stark truth. The fate of hundreds rested entirely in their hands. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Each creaking tree, each shifting shadow, each snowflake became a part of the pattern Thompson was calculating. The Germans had no idea they were walking into a trap of their own making. An invisible, mathematical trap laid by one quiet American gunner who had mastered angles, probabilities, and the deadly geometry of war. Thompson's mind raced. He knew that a direct shot at the Tiger was impossible. Its frontal armor was too thick. But the column itself was fragile, a chain, and each link could be broken. The problem was no longer observation. The problem was action. For the first time, the quiet clock considered disobedience. Waiting meant death. Acting without orders could mean court-martial. The choice was terrifying, and yet the solution had begun to form in his mind. A pattern, a sequence, a firing strategy that no one had authorized, no one had even imagined. It was the beginning of something that could change the course of the battle, and perhaps save hundreds of lives in the process. Thompson looked at his crew. Kowalski, Peterson, and S. waited, unaware that the rules of war were about to be rewritten. The forest was silent. The German column advanced, relentless and unsuspecting. And somewhere inside the icy heart of the Ardennes, a single American gunner was preparing to do the impossible. The snow fell steadily. The wind howled through the skeletal trees. And for the first time in days the forest seemed alive, not with danger but with opportunity. The calm was over. The storm was about to begin. The ridge was silent, except for the faint groan of the frozen forest under the weight of snow. Inside the M10 Wolverine, Ray Thompson moved with deliberate precision. His fingers traced the controls of the gunner's traverse wheel as naturally as a pianist fingers the keys of a piano. Around him, the cold metal cage creaked with each movement, a reminder of how fragile life was inside these armored walls. For 2 days Thompson had observed. He had counted every tank, noted every angle, memorized the spacing between vehicles, and calculated the trajectory of each potential shot. The Tiger at the lead, the Panzer IVs supporting, half-tracks and supply trucks in the rear. The German column was not just advancing, it was a machine. A machine with patterns, weaknesses, and predictable rhythms. And Thompson could see them all. Sergeant Kowalski watched him quietly. "Ray," he said, voice low, "we shouldn't be doing this. Orders are clear. We wait for confirmation." But Thompson did not respond. His mind was elsewhere. Probability and geometry were not suggestions, they were truth. And the truth was waiting would cost lives. Peterson, gripping the steering wheel, tried to focus on the terrain ahead. As ever the Joker had gone silent, his eyes wide with anticipation and fear. They had seen the Germans advance like ghosts through the fog. Now, the shadows they had followed were moving with purpose, drawing closer to the crossroads of Noville. Thompson's heart did not pound. There was no adrenaline rushing through him. He did not feel fear. He felt clarity. He remembered the briefing with Captain Langston. "Do not fire without orders," the captain had said. That command was not a suggestion, it was a law. But laws were not patterns, not probability, not survival. Thompson understood that the rules existed for situations where calculation failed. But in this moment his calculations were flawless. Every second he waited was measured. Every move of the German column had already been accounted for. Through the periscope, he noted the lead Tiger turning slightly to adjust its path through a narrow stretch of road. The Panzer IVs followed in perfect alignment, their engines a mechanical rhythm against the stillness of the forest. The supply trucks brought up the rear, unaware of the trap being laid by a gunner they would never see. Thompson's mind mapped the sequence. The third vehicle in line, he realized, was the key. Hit it correctly and the entire formation could be disrupted. Kowalski's voice broke his concentration. "Ray, if we fire we're risking everything. Not just us but the men down the line." Thompson pressed his lips together. He did not argue. The decision was already made in his mind. Probability dictated action. Hesitation was death. He gave a single, calm command. "Sal, load armor-piercing. Third vehicle in line." The loader, S, obeyed immediately, sliding a heavy shell into the breach with practiced ease. The metallic clang resonated through the tank, a quiet herald of the chaos to come. Thompson adjusted the gun, factoring in range, wind, and the slight downward angle from the ridge. He had studied this for hours. He had practiced in his mind, calculating the perfect shot, the angle, the impact point. The Tiger and the Panzer IVs moved as if in slow motion. To an untrained observer, it was a line of unstoppable steel. To Thompson it was a puzzle. He could see the weakness, the point where one correct move could unravel everything. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, ready to release a single decision that would change the battle. He fired. The roar of the M10's gun shattered the frozen silence, a thunderclap that echoed through the trees. The shell hurtled across the 800-yard gap and struck the third vehicle in the column. The result was instantaneous. The Panzer IV erupted in fire, the ammunition inside cooking off in a violent explosion. The column behind it slammed into the wreckage, armored vehicles colliding in panic. The Tiger in front skidded slightly, the driver shouting orders that could not be obeyed fast enough. Chaos had descended. Thompson did not pause. "Reload. Sixth vehicle," he commanded. The second shell tore through a half-track packed with Panzer grenadiers. Fire and smoke consumed it, sending the soldiers scrambling into the snow for cover. The rhythm of destruction had begun, but it was precise, controlled, not random, not panicked. Each shot followed the pattern Thompson had calculated, each strike a piece of the puzzle collapsing in perfect order. Peterson maneuvered the M10 slightly, moving just enough to avoid detection by the German gunners trying to locate the source of the fire. The forest became a living weapon in Thompson's hands, terrain and distance working together. The Germans fired blindly, their discipline failing as their formation shattered. Tracers spat into the trees, but they were firing at shadows, not men. The column slowed, stalled, and twisted into itself like a serpent caught in its own coils. Thompson's mind remained calm. He was not killing recklessly, he was dismantling methodically. Geometry, timing, and pattern, the tools of a mathematician, became weapons of war. The Tiger at the front pivoted, trying to locate the source of the destruction. Its massive gun swung across the valley, but Thompson had already calculated its movement, already moved to a new position behind a small rise. Each second, each action, was a step in a carefully choreographed dance of survival and destruction. Thompson took aim at the eighth vehicle, a fuel-laden truck that could cause a devastating secondary explosion. He fired. The resulting fireball consumed the rear of the column, creating panic, confusion, and more collisions. Smoke and flame obscured the battlefield, giving Thompson and his crew the cover they needed to continue the methodical dismantling of the German formation. Inside the M10, the crew worked with silent precision. Thompson remained focused, unshaken, eyes scanning, calculating, predicting. Kowalski, Peterson, and S were part of the machine now, instruments guided by the quiet genius in the gunner's seat. The Germans, superior in armor and numbers, were being undone by one man's mind, one sequence of shots that no one had authorized but which was mathematically perfect. By the time the dust and smoke cleared, the German column was in ruin. Tanks, trucks, and half-tracks lay twisted, burned, and abandoned. The disciplined spearhead had become a chaotic graveyard of steel and fire. The survivors fled into the woods, terrified, confused, and unable to comprehend what had happened. Thompson leaned back in his seat, face pale but expression calm. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He methodically ejected spent shell casings, already thinking of the next sequence, already analyzing the aftermath. To him, victory was not glory, it was the successful execution of a pattern, a problem solved, a sequence completed. The forest was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was heavy with destruction, with fire and smoke, with the knowledge that one man's mind had changed the course of a battle. The quiet genius had acted where others hesitated. He had taken responsibility where the chain of command had failed. And in that frozen Ardennes forest, the ghost battery had been born. The smoke from the burning German column rose in thick, black plumes, twisting against the gray winter sky. The valley below was a graveyard of steel and fire. Tank hulls lay twisted, wheels torn from their axles, ammunition scattered in frozen craters. For the Americans who had waited behind their lines, it was hard to believe that one M10 Wolverine and its crew could have caused such devastation. Inside the Wolverine, the air was heavy with cordite and the acrid stench of metal and fire. Peterson and S sat in silence, breathing hard, staring out at the scene that had unfolded like a nightmare made real. Sergeant Kowalski broke the silence first. "I don't think they'll believe this," he muttered, shaking his head. "One gunner, one tank?" Thompson said nothing. He methodically cleaned the gun, checking the chamber, ejecting spent shells. His eyes, though, remained fixed on the battlefield. Every detail mattered. Every angle, every trajectory, every failed attempt by the Germans to retaliate had been noted, recorded in the precise calculations forming in his mind. The Germans were in chaos. Hetman Richter, the Tiger commander, could hardly comprehend what had happened. He had led a disciplined elite column through the Ardennes, expecting minimal resistance. Now his men were scattered, panicked, and terrified. He barked orders, but the snow-choked valley had become a maze of destruction. The lead Tiger had been avoided entirely, the rear was on fire. Ammunition detonations echoed sporadically through the woods, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The Germans were seeing ghosts. Pfizer, a young lieutenant captured later by American patrols, described the event in trembling words. They were everywhere, he stammered, eyes wide with fear. At first we thought it was an artillery strike. Then a battery, no, 100 guns. But there was no one. Just shadows, fire, and death. The legend of the ghost battery began here. Even among the 101st Airborne, whispers spread quickly. Soldiers spoke of the unseen Americans, of the one tank that moved like a ghost, firing at perfect points in the column, appearing and disappearing like shadows in the snow. Every survivor seemed to add to the story, exaggerating, fearing, mythologizing. To them it could not be just one gunner. It had to be an entire phantom battalion. Back on the ridge, Thompson's crew remained focused. The official chain of command could not know yet what had happened. Captain Langston would arrive soon. Thompson knew that reporting the events could mean both accolades and punishment. They had disobeyed a direct order. The rules of engagement were clear. Yet, they had saved the northern flank of the 101st, halted the German advance, and ensured the safety of hundreds of American soldiers. The cost-benefit analysis was simple in Thompson's mind, even if it was politically dangerous. Hours passed before the first friendly units approached the ridge. A reconnaissance squad from the 101st moved cautiously, expecting enemy resistance. Instead, they found the aftermath of a calculated massacre. Burned-out tanks, overturned half-tracks, scattered equipment, and the smell of smoke and cordite hanging in the cold air. The soldiers stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend how a single crew had created such havoc without support. Langston arrived later that day. His jeep churned through the muddy paths, stopping abruptly at the crest of the ridge. He stared down at the valley below, mouth slightly agape. The reports from the reconnaissance squad had prepared him, but nothing could prepare him for the sight itself. "Report," he said quietly, almost in disbelief, turning to Kowalski. Kowalski recounted the events, detailing every observation, every decision, every shot. He emphasized that Thompson had made the choices, that the crew had followed a single calculated plan. Langston's face was unreadable. He had trained men to follow orders, to obey, to rely on command. Yet here was proof that sometimes survival and success depended on thinking beyond orders. Langston turned to Thompson. "The firing pattern," he said, voice steady but filled with gravity. "Walk me through it." Thompson calmly described the sequence. 3rd vehicle to block, 6th vehicle to halt the infantry, 8th vehicle for the chain reaction. He spoke not with pride, not with drama, but with the clarity of someone explaining a mathematical equation. To him, this was logic, probability, and geometry applied to survival and warfare. Langston listened without interruption, absorbing every detail. He understood both the brilliance and the danger of Thompson's actions. One misstep could have destroyed not just the Germans but their own unit as well. Yet the outcome was undeniable. The German advance was halted. The 101st Airborne's flank was secured. Hundreds of lives were spared. By evening, news of the event began to circulate quietly through the division. Soldiers told their stories in hushed tones. The ghost battery, some whispered, fearful and awed. Others spoke of the M10 as if it were a living thing, a spirit of vengeance moving through the Ardennes. The legend grew, even as official reports remained silent, waiting for verification. The Germans too would tell their stories. Reports later captured by intelligence officers described a phantom force of American tanks, firing from positions that could not exist. Hetman Richter could not explain the failure of his elite column. Pfizer's accounts, later verified, painted the picture of chaos, fire, and unseen enemies. To them, it was a disaster orchestrated by ghosts, a precise punishment for arrogance and overconfidence. Meanwhile, Thompson and his crew cleaned and inspected their M10, checking weapons and equipment as if preparing for routine exercises. There was no celebration. No smiles. The work was done, the battlefield controlled, the enemy destroyed. But the consequences of breaking protocol lingered in their minds. They had saved lives, yes, but they had done so at great personal risk. As night fell, the ridge became quiet again. Thompson gazed through his periscope at the burned valley, reflecting not on glory but on necessity. He understood something crucial: courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it calculates. And sometimes, it pulls the trigger at the exact right moment to save hundreds from annihilation. The Ghost Battery had been born, not in fire and smoke alone, but in the mind of a single man who saw the battlefield as a puzzle waiting to be solved. And legends, Thompson knew, are rarely recognized in official records. They live in whispers, in awe, in fear, in the stories soldiers tell long after the guns have gone silent. The battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. On the frozen ridge where the M10 Wolverine sat, Thompson and his crew had a moment to breathe, yet relief was tempered by the knowledge that their actions had skirted disaster as much as they had created it. The snow around them was scorched in places, blackened by the residue of fire and exploding ammunition. The forest was silent, save for the distant crackle of smoldering wreckage. Captain Langston returned to the ridge later that afternoon, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had witnessed the destruction from above, listened to the crew's account, and now stood in the cold, staring at the silent M10. "You understand, gentlemen," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "what you've done today, it's beyond reckoning. You saved lives, yes, but you defied direct orders. And in the Army, that's serious business." Kowalski shifted uneasily. "Sir," he began, "it was Thompson's plan. I just followed his lead." Thompson, as always, said nothing. His calm, methodical demeanor concealed the adrenaline still coursing through him. The calculations in his mind ran silently, tracing trajectories, ranges, angles, probabilities, the same patterns that had guided his hands through the carnage below. Langston sighed, exhaling a cloud of frost into the frigid air. "I need to report this. It's going to division headquarters. They'll decide what to do. Court-martial, medal, commendation, or they might simply bury it. There's no precedent for what you've accomplished." He looked directly at Thompson. "And you, Ray, you need to be prepared for the consequences." For the next 2 days, Thompson and his crew waited in a state of suspended tension. Every vehicle passing along the frozen road, every soldier approaching the ridge, caused a jolt of anxiety. They had become legends without intending to. The 101st Airborne spoke of the Ghost Battery in hushed tones, soldiers treating the tale as both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Germans, through prisoner reports, described a phantom force annihilating a perfectly disciplined column. The stories began to spread, each retelling adding a layer of myth to the reality. Meanwhile, intelligence officers from division headquarters descended upon the Ardennes Ridge. They moved with methodical precision, documenting, photographing, measuring, and questioning. They studied every crater, every scorch mark, every destroyed vehicle, attempting to reconstruct the battle. And then they interviewed Thompson and his crew separately. Thompson remained calm throughout, explaining his sequence of shots, the reasoning behind his targeting, and the controlled collapse strategy that had dismantled the German column. He did not boast, he did not embellish. He spoke as though teaching a lesson in geometry, probability, and battlefield tactics. "I calculated the weakest points," he told them. "The third vehicle first, to block. The sixth, to halt the infantry. The eighth, to create a chain reaction. That sequence," he said simply, "destroyed the column without exposing our position fully." The officers were stunned. Here was a high school-educated gunner describing concepts of tactical precision that rivaled any officer's training. His notebooks were filled with sketches, calculations, and diagrams that demonstrated not just courage, but intellect and a deep understanding of armored warfare. They could see the genius in his logic, but legality and protocol weighed heavily on their judgment. The radio logs confirmed the impossibility. Thompson's unit had attempted contact with headquarters repeatedly. The static and frozen lines meant no orders had ever reached them. Technically, no direct command had been violated. The officers faced a paradox. One man had defied standard procedures, but no procedure could have saved the situation in time. One man had rewritten the rules on the battlefield, yet remained within the invisible gray zone of military law. Langston was summoned to the headquarters, where a stern general reviewed the detailed report. The photographs of the destroyed German column, the meticulous field notebooks, and the testimony of prisoners painted a clear picture. A single gunner, acting alone under frozen winter skies, had destroyed an entire armored spearhead. The general stared at the pages, rubbing his temples. This is either the most reckless act I've ever read about, or an unparalleled stroke of genius, he muttered. Public recognition was impossible. To honor Thompson openly would encourage other soldiers to ignore direct orders. The consequences could be catastrophic if replicated without careful judgment. Yet, to punish him would be a travesty. The 101st Airborne had been saved. Lives had been spared. Entire strategic positions were secured. After deliberation, the decision was quietly made. The report would be classified, Thompson's actions anonymized, and no medals issued. His genius would influence military doctrine, but his name would remain hidden from official recognition. A few weeks later, Thompson received his reassignment quietly. He was not promoted, not decorated. Instead, he was sent to train other battalion gunners, tasked with teaching the principles behind the controlled collapse strategy he had used in the Ardennes. The Army recognized his intellect in secrecy, ensuring that his tactical innovations would ripple through doctrine for decades without ever celebrating the man himself. Back on the ridge, the M10 Wolverine was cleaned and repaired, the crew preparing for their next mission. They had survived the chaos of the Ardennes, faced the consequences of defiance, and yet remained a cohesive unit. Thompson continued to calculate, plan, and observe, his mind always searching for patterns, weaknesses, and solutions. Courage, he had shown, was not always loud or recognized. Sometimes it was quiet, calculated, precise. The Ghost Battery lived on, not as a single tank or a single crew, but as a legend whispered among soldiers, feared by enemies and studied by military minds. Thompson had not sought glory, and he had received none. Yet, in the quiet of the Ardennes, amidst snow, smoke, and shattered steel, he had achieved something greater than medals or recognition. He had changed the course of battle with intellect, courage, and unshakable calm. The Ardennes winter faded slowly, leaving behind a scarred forest of twisted metal and burnt trees. For the soldiers who had witnessed it, the memory of that day lingered like smoke in the cold air, a story of courage, calculation, and near miraculous timing. The Ghost Battery, as the paratroopers had whispered, became legend, a force of myth and awe that seemed larger than any single tank or crew could possibly be. Ray Thompson returned to his new assignment quietly, taking up a post training other battalion gunners. The classroom was stark, maps pinned to walls, firing diagrams spread across tables, and the smell of chalk dust hanging in the air. He did not teach heroics. He taught mathematics, logic, and battlefield strategy. Controlled collapse. Probability. Geometry applied to destruction. To him, war was a puzzle of angles, lines, and sequences, and every student under his supervision would learn to see the battlefield as he had. At first, some of the trainees were skeptical. They had expected tales of bravery and instinct, not lectures on armor thickness, turret rotation, and line-of-fire calculations. But Thompson did not need charisma or drama. He had results. When he demonstrated the Ghost Battery technique on miniature terrain boards, simulating tank movements and choke points, the young gunners watched in awe as the dominoes fell, vehicles disabled with surgical precision. No imagination could match the clarity of mathematics applied to war. In classrooms and on training grounds across the United States, Thompson's diagrams became quietly legendary. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, instructors examined his notes, impressed by the clarity and rigor of the approach. 4 decades afterward, artillery and armored doctrine referenced the case study, always anonymized, always abstracted, but always acknowledged as a breakthrough in tactical thinking. Controlled collapse, asymmetrical engagement sequencing, the principles behind the Ghost Battery, they shaped a generation of soldiers who would face armored columns across Europe and later in Cold War scenarios. Yet Thompson's own life remained ordinary, deceptively so. He returned to Kansas after the war to a small engine repair shop where he repaired tractors, harvesters, and cars. Neighbors knew him as a quiet man, dependable, with hands as steady as his mind. He married a woman named Helen, raised 2 children, and taught his son geometry in the dirt outside their house. Nobody in town suspected that this modest mechanic had once held the fate of hundreds in his hands. The war had given him skills, not recognition. Courage, strategy, and intellect remained private triumphs, quietly shaping the future without ever appearing in headlines. Occasionally, historians and military writers seeking the Ghost Battery would track down vague leads. One such historian, decades later, found Thompson in his 80s, living quietly in a small town. When asked about that day in the Ardennes, Thompson's eyes went distant. He did not speak of medals, orders, or glory. He spoke of the snow, the silence, and the moment when the decision had been unavoidable. By the time the radio worked, he said softly, it would have been too late. I didn't break the rules. I stepped past them long enough to do what had to be done. That explanation, so simple and logical, captured the essence of Thompson's life and legacy. The Ghost Battery had not existed in numbers but in thought. Its power lay in observation, patience, and the courage to act when certainty demanded it. The Germans had seen a phantom, the Americans had saved a battalion. The world of war often reduced heroism to medals, paperwork, and headlines. Thompson's victory existed outside those measures, immortal only in precision, thought, and calculation. Even in military academies, his techniques would be cited without ever naming the man who conceived them. Students learned the art of controlled collapse, the mathematics of battlefield geometry, the timing of sequential strikes, all without knowing the story of the Kansas farm boy whose mind had rewritten the rules. This anonymity Thompson accepted. Recognition was not necessary for effectiveness. Impact was enough. And so, the Ghost Battery lived on. In winter training exercises, in war games, in the whispered lessons of artillery instructors and tank commanders, its principles endured. Soldiers learned that the most powerful weapon is not always firepower, nor rank, nor even bravery, but the ability to see, calculate, and act decisively when every second counts. Ray Thompson's story remained a quiet echo in the vast chronicles of World War II. A single gunner, a single decision, a perfect pattern. No parades, no ceremonies, no headlines. Just a life returned to simplicity, carrying with it the invisible weight of a battlefield forever changed by intellect, courage, and an unwavering understanding of cause and effect. And in the forests of the Ardennes, where snow once muffled the roar of Tiger tanks and the world seemed suspended in frost and fear, the Ghost Battery continued to haunt history, not as a name in a book, but as a lesson in precision, strategy, and the quiet power of one mind capable of changing everything. Years passed, and the snow of the Ardennes faded into memory, leaving only stories whispered among soldiers, historians, and strategists. Yet for those who had witnessed it, and for the families who lived to tell of their fathers and brothers, the events of December 19, 1944, never truly ended. One man carried the weight of that day quietly, Ray Thompson, the Kansas farm boy turned legendary gunner. In the small town where he settled after the war, Thompson's life appeared ordinary. He rose early to repair engines, fix tractors and combines, and taught his children the precision of geometry by scratching angles in the dirt. Neighbors knew him as calm, dependable, and skilled with his hands. Few understood the magnitude of the decisions he had made in the Ardennes, the thousands of lives that had been saved by a single calculated act of courage. His war existed in whispers, in memories of distant gunfire, and in diagrams tucked away in the files of military schools. Despite anonymity, Thompson's influence grew quietly. At Fort Sill and in training facilities across the United States, officers and instructors studied the Ghost Battery techniques. Controlled collapse, asymmetrical engagement sequencing, and precise targeting of armored columns became standard lessons. Soldiers learned that victory was often not about raw power, but about understanding, observation, and timing. Thompson's genius, though unnamed, shaped the strategies of armored warfare for decades. He never sought recognition and he never received it. No medals hung on his wall, no ceremonies marked his courage. Yet, those who knew the story even partially understood its impact. Soldiers of the 101st Airborne, the men whose lives had been spared that cold winter day, often spoke of the mysterious M10 Wolverine crew who had turned the battlefield into a trap for an entire German column. The Germans themselves carried tales of a phantom force, a ghost battery that struck without warning, moved like shadows, and vanished before retaliation could begin. In their reports, they described an enemy that seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. Thompson occasionally reflected on the events of that day. He remembered the frost biting his hands, the silence of the forest, and the moment when the German column filled his periscope. He recalled the precise calculations, the sequential shots, the panic that unfolded among the enemy as one vehicle after another collapsed in fire and smoke. The roar of the M10's gun, the explosions, and the screams of men, both enemy and friend, were etched into his memory. And yet, for Thompson, the decisive factor had always been clarity of thought. Courage, he knew, was secondary to understanding. In interviews with historians decades later, Thompson described the war in terms of patterns and probabilities. It was never about bravery, he said softly. It was about seeing the outcome before it happened, and making the choice that had to be made. Timing, angles, sequence, those are the real weapons. The historian nodded, astonished by the calm intellect behind a story so violent, so terrifying, and so extraordinary. Thompson's story became a case study, known in classrooms and training centers, though always anonymized. Soldiers learned the principles, practiced simulations, and carried the lessons into wars that would follow. They were taught that one well-calculated action could change the fate of hundreds or thousands. That one mind, disciplined and precise, could accomplish what an entire battalion might fail to achieve. Back in Kansas, Thompson continued his quiet life. He taught his children to see the world in lines, angles, and possibilities. He repaired engines with the same care he had once applied to firing solutions. He rarely spoke of the Ardennes, and when he did, it was in terms of patterns and logic, not heroism. To him, the battle had been a problem to solve, a sequence to calculate, a moment where hesitation could cost lives. He had acted, survived, and moved on. The legend of the Ghost Battery endured, carried in memory and study rather than fame. Soldiers whispered of it as a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. Enemy forces feared it in stories, never knowing it had been a single gunner with a mind sharp as a scalpel and hands steady in ice and fire. The world saw only the aftermath, a shattered German column, a strategic crossroads secured, and a fleeting whisper of impossible precision. Ray Thompson never sought recognition. He never received public accolades. And yet, his legacy was complete. It was not medals or headlines that defined him, but the quiet power of intellect, courage, and the understanding that one mind could reshape history in a single decisive act. And so the Ardennes remembered him, not by name but by action. The Ghost Battery, the invisible force of winter and calculation, remained a symbol of what a single disciplined mind could achieve when faced with impossible choices. One man, one decision, one perfect pattern, an enduring legend that outlived the guns, the soldiers, and even the war itself.